So, today's slidecast is about unprefixed verbs of motion. By unprefixed, we're talking about verbs that don't have this, what we call spatial prefixes, usually. Prefixes that change the meaning of the verb from just go to cross, pass, drive under, drive over, etc. Now, I want to emphasize that you need to go and learn the conjugations from offered, noting that several of these verbs have hidden stems, like plits, plivu, pliviosh. So what I mean by hidden is that when you look at the infinitive, you can't tell what the stem of the present tense is going to be, because you would not necessarily guess that there's a V hiding in that plits. Yechatz is the same, although that one you're probably pretty familiar with. Yedu, yedish. Visti with an S, vidu, vidiosh. Bijats, definitely look at the conjugation of that one. It is one of 4 irregular verbs in Russian. While some of these others may seem irregular, they actually don't qualify as irregular. So please make sure to go back through and learn those conjugations. Spend some time drilling the meanings of the verbs, because I think many of you probably, some of you do, many of you may not know lest and polsti and gnats and some of the other verbs that show up in offered. So I'm going to leave that up to you to spend some time on. That's very, very mechanical, and it's not something that I want to spend a lot of time on in class. We're going to talk about unidirectional versus multidirectional verbs. Offered, unfortunately, uses kind of an old-fashioned terminology, calls unidirectional verbs determinate verbs, and multidirectional verbs indeterminate. I prefer, as I said, to talk about directionality, because I think it's a more direct sense of what these verbs mean. Please be aware that both of these verbs are imperfective. When I was first learning Russian, I used to think that hadits was the imperfective and iti was the perfective, especially when you start getting words like determinate and indeterminate, which sound somewhat similar to perfective and imperfective. These are both imperfective verbs. That means they can be used in the present tense, and it means that they can be used to describe repeated actions. I'm going to start with some of the meanings of the unidirectional verbs. I'm not really going to talk about future tense with these so much. I may make a brief mention of them. So the major meaning of unidirectional verbs is exactly as it sounds: movement in one direction. It's one of the most common forms that you find in the present tense, especially if you're looking to translate something like am going, are going. You will most likely see a unidirectional verb. Note that it can be used in the past tense, but its use is somewhat restricted. It's not as common to hear the unidirectional verbs in the past tense. And typically, it needs additional information. It sounds incomplete to say Sergei shol domoy. Sergei was walking home. If you think even in English, Sergei was walking home, then you expect more information. That might be okay as part of a narrative. Sergei was walking home as he walked down the street, and in this case that would also still be unidirectional. As he was walking down the street, his phone rang. So you expect additional information. Here, some of the additional information might be how he walked, how long it took him to walk. Sergei shol domoy 10 minut. He was walking 10 minutes towards home. Or what he was doing while he was walking. Often it's interrupted motion or part of a greater narrative. So just to simply a sentence kind of out of context like "Я шла в библиотеку" just doesn't make any sense. It needs a lot more information. It needs to be part of a broader context. Now, please be aware this seems unusual. This is why it's really important to realize that these verbs, unidirectional and multidirectional, are both imperfective, because unidirectional verbs can refer to repeated motion, especially and typically when you're talking about repeated motion in one direction. A very common place that you'll see this is каждое утро в 7 часов студенты идут в университет. You can sometimes see it and often will see it without the time frame, but when you specify a time, think about how you would use this. At 7 o'clock in the morning, you are going in one direction. So you may go to the university and come back every day, but you're not doing both at 7 o'clock in the morning. At 7 o'clock in the morning, you are going in one direction. And the same can be said of the past tense. So every morning at 7 o'clock, I used to go to the university. So again, it's at that one moment in time, especially when you specify the particular time, even if it is every day. Although you will sometimes see it even without the time, but then what you're emphasizing is not the fact that they go and come back every day, but emphasizing that one trip in one direction. Unidirectional verbs, present tense unidirectional verbs are very often used for future plans, for something you've intended to do. So, сегодня вечером мы идем в театр. You've certainly heard that. It's similar to мы хотим пойти в театр, мы решили пойти, мы собираемся пойти. So you have plans to go. Just like in English, we do the same thing. Next week I'm going to Philadelphia, for instance. And as far as future tense, while it's not up here, I will say that you can use it essentially in the same way that the past tense is used. So it needs to have some additional information, and I think it's probably even less common in the future tense than in the past tense, where you would probably use a perfective verb with a prefix on it. So you might be able to say, while on your way home. That's kind of what this means in the future tense or the past tense. This unidirectional verb has a sense of on the way. So you could say, while I will be driving home, I will stop by the store and pick up some milk. Когда я буду ехать домой. But that doesn't sound very normal. Something about that sounds a little bit strange. Now to talk about multidirectional verbs. In the past tense only, and again, I'm going to say it, in the past tense only, a multidirectional verb can refer to one single round trip. And that is the equivalent of saying that I was somewhere. So I went to the doctor yesterday, I was at the doctor yesterday. It's the same thing. It's two directions because you went there and you came back. You are no longer still at the doctor. So вчера друзья ходили на концерт is the same as вчера друзья были на концерте. In the present tense, it cannot mean one single round trip. If you use it in the present tense, it is going to mean that there are repeated round trips. So каждую субботу друзья ездят за город. I left out the verb there. Ездит за город. Every Saturday they go out of town. Even if you don't say каждую субботу, if you say друзья ездят за город, a native Russian listening to it is going to understand that this is repeated, that it's not just once. In the past tense, it can also mean a repeated round trip or a single round trip. So here you may need to give some additional context. A lot of times it will be understood based on what you're talking about. But if you don't put каждую субботу or something in, it might be a little difficult to interpret. And then multidirectional verbs are used to talk about any sort of unspecified movement, moving in many directions, running around. So дети бегают по парку, дети бегали по парку. Children are running around the park. So a lot of times you'll see по plus the dative in the sense of around the park. Я не люблю летать на самолете. I don't like to fly on airplanes. So this is unspecified movement. We're not talking about any direction. We're not going there and back. We're not going anywhere. It's just around and around or just general movement. And it can often, as part of that unspecified movement, can refer to ability. So ребенок уже ходит is the same as ребенок уже умеет ходить. So he can walk already. He's already walking. And in the past tense, it can have the same thing. Ребенок был маленький, еще не ходил. You can use either nominative or instrumental here after ребенок был маленький. It doesn't really matter that much. Еще не ходил. He wasn't walking yet. So we're talking about his ability. Again, this is just unspecified motion. Just walking around in general. So those are the major meanings of multidirectional verbs. And in the future tense, it's much the same. Future tense will never mean one single round trip. Я буду ездить во Флориду will always mean that I'm going to go repeatedly to Florida, not that I'm going to go to Florida one time. We'll talk about multidirectional verbs with the perfective a little bit later. Okay, so as a summary, in the past tense, multidirectional verbs can refer to one round trip, repeated round trips, unspecified motion or ability. Unidirectional is always movement in one direction or multiple trips in one direction, and it requires additional information. Present tense can be multiple round trips, unspecified motion, ability, and unidirectional present tense is movement in one direction, or it can be used to talk about planned trips in the future. I don't have any exercises with this. Please do your exercises and offered. Please check them. I think that that's probably the biggest problem that many of you are having with keeping up with the material. So please make sure you do the exercises in the textbook and correct your work. And if you have questions, bring your questions to class tomorrow. Thank you.